Number 5 on this list is SCP-513. SCP-513 is a very rusty cowbell that cannot be cleaned off no matter how hard somebody tries. This cowbell is extremely dangerous and must be locked up, and especially never rung. If this bell is rung, then all those within a 120-foot radius of this ring, they're in for some trouble. The second that you hear this ring, you will become cursed. You may not be aware that you're cursed at first because the early symptoms are simply anxiety and the feeling that someone's watching you, but that stage of the curse goes by fast because within an hour you're gonna start to catch glimpses of SCP-513-1. SCP-513-1 is a very tall and slender humanoid figure that's limbs are far too long for its body. It's kind of similar to Slenderman, but the length of its limbs make it a little bit more unsettling to look at. An hour after this ring, this creature is going to begin appearing. You may see it as you pass by a mirror or as you turn a corner. If you ever make direct eye contact with it, then it's going to vanish just as quickly as it appeared. This curse is going to stay with someone forever, and no one else is going to be able to help you or even see what you're going through. This causes those who are cursed to experience severe sleep deprivation and slowly lose their minds. Many victims will eventually take their own lives because they believe it's the only way out of this walking nightmare. Something that has this ability needs to get locked away forever. Ideally, it should even be destroyed, but considering we can't even get the rust off of it, I would assume it's probably impenetrable. If anyone with ill intentions got a hold of this bell and started ringing it in a crowded area like a city or a mall, then all hell would break loose. If it was up to me, then this thing is getting locked up in the deepest vault possible, and then we're throwing away the key. Number 4 on this list is SCP-572. SCP-572 is a sword. It's not the type of sword that you'd want to use though, because it honestly kind of sucks. The Foundation writes, the weapon is badly balanced for combat use, is made of substandard steel, and does not hold an effective combat edge. So really not the type of weapon that you'd want to take into a fight unless it was your last option. But it's that exact reason why its curse is so dangerous. The Foundation goes on to say, the weapon has the unusual psychotropic quality of convincing any person who holds it of its balance and cutting power, as well as conferring feelings of great strength and invincibility. Basically, if you hold this sword, you automatically start thinking that you're some type of sword god, when really you're just holding a long rusty butter knife. This overconfidence is said to lead people into performing very dangerous stunts with this sword. They'll try to cut a car in half as it's going full speed at them, try and slice a bullet in two as it's being shot at them, attempt to fight actual trained professionals with far more experience and way better weapons. As you can imagine, all of these things don't end very well for those who attempt them. Many people who end up with this sword either end up dying in some gruesome way from their own overconfidence, or at the very least get maimed horribly and barely survive. The worst part about this sword as well is that once you're holding onto it, you refuse to give it up. Kind of like the One Ring from Lord of the Rings, this sword is said to appeal to the holder's greed, and they just refuse to let it go. An item like this is simply too dangerous to be out in the world. It's just one big disaster waiting to happen. Lock it away and keep it there forever. Number 3 on this list is SCP-2307-1. SCP-23071 is definitely a weird one. It isn't as dangerous as some of the other entries on this list, but it definitely needs to be kept locked away if possible. The Foundation describes it as the remains of a long sword with a 56cm hilt and a partial blade approximately 40cm in length, estimated to be approximately 43% of its original size. Carbon dating has shown that the hilt and crossguard of the sword date to approximately the 4th century CE. However, the metal used in the blade dates to approximately 3.2 billion BCE. SCP-23071 is in a severe state of disrepair as a result of being submerged in water for at least 1,300 years. So once again guys, we're dealing with a sword that really isn't too much to look at all. But similarly to our last sword entry, something very strange happens when somebody touches the hilt of said sword. The Foundation writes, SCP-23071's primary anomaly manifests when a subject makes contact with the hilt of the sword. Following this, all records pertaining to the subject will gradually distort in a manner that reflects positively on the subject, giving wildly different accounts of their life over a period of time. It starts slow, but basically over the course of several years, everything that is known about you is going to change. Your birth certificate will be inaccurate, your bank statements will be wrong, your name is going to change. Every single thing that indicates who you are will have changed without you doing anything about it. When you die, your death certificate will be wrong as well. No one will have known who you were or what you did because your whole life story is going to be documented with a bunch of lies. Like I said, it's not the most dangerous on this list, but also something that we don't really need happening to people on the regular. Number 2 on this list is SCP-3008. SCP-3008 may just be the strangest SCP that I've ever come across. There are multiple things that go on with this SCP, but the Foundation's initial description of it is a large retail unit previously owned by and branded as IKEA, a popular furniture retail chain. They go on to write that the inside of the store is a space resembling the inside of an IKEA furniture store, extending far beyond the limits of what could physically be contained within the dimensions of the retail unit. Current measurements indicate an area of at least 10 kilometers squared with no visible external terminators detected in any direction. So this item is actually a massive IKEA store that from the outside looks like a normal IKEA. This SCP gets even weirder though. There are apparently people who are trapped inside this massive SCP who have actually been there long enough to have built settlements and a small society. And these people who are trapped inside this IKEA have to regularly defend themselves against these humanoid entities that resemble IKEA workers but have no facial features and become extremely violent at nighttime. I should also note that it's very difficult to leave the IKEA once you get trapped inside because the exits continually move around the store at unknown times. So if that's not the craziest SCP that you've ever heard of, then I actually don't know what is. But luckily for us, SCP-3008 is currently contained and it has to stay that way. We have no idea how many people are currently trapped inside this IKEA and how many have died in there. If this IKEA was ever not contained and it was just on the street, then one simple trip to go get a new bath curtain could completely change your life forever. Hopefully one day all of the people currently trapped in there can escape, but for now, we need to keep that thing locked up. Number 1 on this list is SCP-666. SCP-666 is a strange one because it's only very dangerous to some individuals. It's described by the Foundation as a medium-sized Tibetan yurt made of tied wooden branches and covered in yak leather. The interior ceiling is 2.44 meters high and the base of the yurt is 9.14 meters. The hut is circular in shape. The interior of the yurt has a dirt floor and appears to be as crude as the outside to the majority of observers. The branches that make up the yurt frame are wrapped in rabbit fur and tied with yak leather thongs. So basically we just have a standard yurt. For many people this yurt will cause no problems at all and one can stay in it as long as they like. However, if someone who has or has had a substance abuse problem goes into the yurt, then some very bad things will happen. SCP-6661 is an entity that is said to appear to those who've dealt with substance abuse problems. This entity will attempt to get that individual to give into their past vices and get them to once again take whatever substance they had a problem with. The person who's in the yurt also can't simply leave because the second they get in there, the whole environment changes to something else. If the person gives into this entity and does take said substance, then the entity gets very violent and often leads to that person's death. This whole thing is really scary and it's really wrong. It seems like this demon creature wants to incite chaos and cause harm to this select group of people. Currently, SCP-666 is contained and similar to the IKEA, it has to stay that way.
Kicking off at number 5, SCP-093. And I absolutely love this skip for its concept alone, because on the surface, SCP-093 seems like just your standard weird, anomalous object that does some pretty spooky stuff, but the more and more you delve into it, the bigger its world becomes. And I mean that in the literal sense, because there's an entire alternate reality attached to it. As the record states, SCP-093 is a red disc carved from stone, adorned with strange engravings and unknown symbols that must be kept secure on a mirror-like surface at all times. Why? No one really knows, but if not, it will seek out the nearest mirror-like surface at all costs, sometimes building at phenomenal speeds until reaching its destination. But of course, this is the SCP Foundation, and SCP-093 actually serves as the key of using mirrors as a portal to a specific alternate dimension, a post-apocalyptic world populated with ravenous monsters known as the Unclean, whose population underwent a technological revolution sometime in the 1850s, and everything kind of went a little bit Warhammer. There's a lot to it, but SCP-093 is one of the most in-depth articles in the whole Foundation, and you can easily fill up a few hours researching it and its bizarre, skin-crawling addendums. It's great. Coming in at number 4, SCP-072. And if you still sleep with a nightlight, please make sure not to accidentally pick up SCP-072 at a second-hand furniture auction, because seriously, I don't say this lightly, if you have trouble sleeping, 072 is really creepy. As the record states, SCP-072 is essentially a bed infected by an unknown anomalous entity that emerges at the foot of said bed by spreading its long, sharp fingers across your feet while the subject is asleep. You know that fear you have when your foot comes out from underneath the covers? Yeah, SCP-072 is the thing that you're afraid of grabbing you. Although this thing doesn't just grab you, it kind of removes your entire foot with its sharp, nightmarish fingers, and you can't really do anything about it because it becomes the physical manifestation of sleep paralysis, rendering its victims unable to scream or call for help. Also, it gets worse because SCP-072 can spread to any bed within a 10-meter vicinity, so yeah, hope to high heaven that hand-me-down bed you got given by your old neighbour doesn't come with a brand new infestation of SCP-072. Swinging in at number 3, SCP-978. aka the Polaroid, and one of the most depressing objects in the entirety of the SCP Foundation. Seriously, on the surface, SCP-978 appears to be just an ordinary looking standard chrome and black Polaroid 1 instant camera, but of course it's far from ordinary because this is the SCP Foundation, and it's the things that it produces that makes it anomalous. The Polaroid photographs. Whoever or whatever it takes a photo of, animals included, won't show the subject as appears in the real world, but will instead depict them somewhere else, doing something else, revealing what the subject most desires to do. If you point it at an otherwise happy person, it will show them enjoying life, partying with friends. If you point it at a person, it will show them dead and buried. But the thing is, the most interesting aspect of SCP-978 is that it's been tested on numerous other skips, the bleakest being SCP-451, a man who cannot see, hear or otherwise detect any other living being, and whose existence has driven him to absolute madness while he thinks he's the only human left on the planet. When SCP-978 was used to take a photograph of this guy, it showed him smiling, surrounded by friends and family, part of the world once again. And now I'm really sad. Next up at number 2, SCP-035. And this one is a doozy to say the least. And make sure you check out the SCP article page for this one, because if you stare long enough, you'll be absolutely terrified. Don't worry, you'll understand, just take a look. SCP-035 appears to be a white porcelain comedy mask, although at times it will change to tragedy. You know, those iconic dramatic images dating all the way back to ancient Greek theatre that are pretty terrifying anyway, never mind being part of the SCP Foundation. When it changes, all existing visual records change with it, including photographs, video footage, even illustrations, automatically changing to reflect its new appearance. Doesn't sound too bad, right? Well, on top of that, a highly corrosive and degenerative liquid of unknown origin constantly seeps from the eye and mouth holes of the mask, and anything that comes into contact with the substance decays over a period of time. Oh, and also SCP-035 is sentient and an absolute mastermind at corrupting and controlling the human mind, often driving those in its nearby vicinity to madness and suicide at a staggering rate, compelling any humanoid figure around it to place the porcelain mask on their own face. For the most part, the Foundation has no idea whatsoever to do with SCP-035, and keeping it contained is proving to only make it angrier, resulting in more secretion of highly corrosive liquid and more madness. So maybe just let it do its thing. Wait a minute, I don't remember scripting that line. And finally, our number 1 spot, SCP-145, which is, for all intents and purposes, one of the most awesome and terrifying horror concepts going, and I'm not sure why no one has adapted it into a horror short film, because It's incredible. So aspiring horror writers, get in touch with the author of SCP-145 and let's get this ball rolling. SCP-145 essentially is a standard 2002 model cordless telephone handset of Alcatel brand on its standard issue charging base, although this phone, when it rings, is a very different conversation. When answered, a female voice speaks, showing high levels of stress varying from conversation to conversation, and in all instances expresses extreme panic, pleading with the listener for assistance as she describes instances of torture conducted on unknown victims. So far, recorded audio documentation of torture has included branding, electrocution, laceration, dismemberment, and some data expunged records too, which is never a good thing. Oh, one more important thing to note: unless the phone is answered under supervision, as in more than 2 people witnessing the call, the recipient will vanish into thin air, and the leading theory is that these victims are the ones tortured on the other line. The Foundation has gone to great lengths to try and save these victims, even going so far as to strapping a D-class personnel with C4 before they answer the call alone and vanish in the hope that they'd blow up the torture scene remotely. Didn't work, and the Foundation has just kind of given up, and they've stopped answering SCP-145's calls. New phone. Who dis? Kicking us off at number 5, SCP-914. Because when you think about it, the possibilities for destruction are endless when applied to SCP-914. As the record states, 914 is classified as a safe object, and all research staff at the Foundation are actually free to test it with approval, although no biological organisms or explosives are allowed to be tested because, well, you'll see why. 914 is a large clockwork device weighing several tons and covering an area of 18 square meters. It is comprised of screwdrivers, belts, pulleys, gears, springs, and other clockwork, consisting of over 8 million tin and copper moving parts. Its 2 main components, however, are labelled intake and output. Essentially, when any object is placed in the intake booth, a small bell sounds, and SCP-914 will refine the said object, resulting in a brand new item that is somehow intrinsically related to the other. Technically, under the right circumstances, SCP-914 could create an object of such immense power that nothing in the Foundation's resources could combat it. Oh, and also it works on humans and biological matter, which can potentially end up creating terrifying humanoid entities hell-bent on destruction. What you put in it, you get out. Just like life, really. Coming in next at number 4, SCP-117, which actually is incredibly similar to SCP-914, although this one is a little bit more intuitive, shall we say. The item in question appears to be a regular multi-tool of unknown make and brand, found in an unknown location at the unspecified time in Florida, of all places. All the weird stuff seems to happen there. At first glance, only its normal tools are found, you know, the regular screwdriver, knife, can opener, but, and this is a very big but, if the user is faced with a task, regardless of what tool the subject intends to pull out and use, another tool perfectly fitted for the job will take its place. Seems awesome, right? But as the old adage goes, always be careful what you wish for. Just think about the implications of this object and you'll slowly get the picture of why it could potentially be so devastatingly powerful. If you walked up to a loose screw on a metal plate with SCP-117 in your hand, it'd reward you with a screwdriver, a piece of timber with proposed cut lines drawn, an electric saw which needs no outside power source, a dirty window, a nozzle that sprays a mixture of soap and water. Yet when you apply it to an unspeakably horrific criminal, it will produce a lethal injection. Essentially, it's the Room of Requirement from Harry Potter in its handy handheld form, except this one has its own sentient moral compass, and it seems that it doesn't always point north. Next up at number 3, SCP-882. And what if metal was sentient? What if gears and cogs had malign motivations to take over the planet? Well, yeah, a question answered by the strange and bizarre amalgamation of objects known as SCP-882. But the thing is, there is much more to this object than first meets the eye. SCP-882 is a large mass of random metallic objects welded together, and if any metallic object of any kind touches this entity, it will fuse with it and permanently become a part of it. On top of that, if it gains enough momentum to make noise, anyone nearby listening to it will seek to add more metal to it. And this is where it was found, in an isolated coastal community at the northeast of Banks Island. The nearby area was barren of all metal and metallic ore in a 1-mile radius, and after the object had awakened and enticed the nearby population to do its bidding, essentially forming a cult around it before they all mysteriously disappeared. SCP-882 only stopped due to it being partly submerged in seawater, causing it to rust and become inactive, which is how it is contained by the Foundation currently. If you know anything about the wider universe of the SCP Foundation, you'll also know that this object is tied into the Church of the Broken God, which is a whole different story and an idea so vast that we'll probably have to do an entire video on it. Sorry. Swinging in next at number 2, SCP-271. Again, I know we said we'd cover an entire video about the Church of the Broken God, but we've got to talk about the object that they're most fervent to steal from the Foundation's warehouse, SCP-271. Why? Because most of these objects are actually the components needed to rebuild McCain, the Broken God, and SCP-271 is perhaps the most powerful piece of the puzzle. As the record states, SCP-271 is a small disc made from an unknown material that is metallic in nature. Engraved on it are a number of symbols that represent an unknown alphabet, although there is currently no known way to actually confirm this. What makes this anomalous object so dangerous is that the symbols engraved on it are infectious to their environment over time, gradually appearing as if invisibly carved into nearby objects. They are capable of escaping through any hole, however small, infecting objects and organisms through an unknown process. Objects that carry the symbols for a sufficient amount of time begin to be changed on a molecular level to the exact same material as SCP-271 in an excruciatingly painful process to biological organisms. If SCP-882 is the mechanical heart of the Broken God, then SCP-271 is its brain, albeit a brain that is infectious and capable of causing massive amounts of destruction given enough time. Spooky stuff. And finally, our number 1 spot, SCP-2700. And now we're getting into the big guns of the SCP Foundation, as in the actual big guns, the things that make other things go boom. Stock for stock, this is probably the most insanely powerful object in the entirety of the Foundation's possession. As the record states, SCP-2700 is a complex mechanical device believed to be a sophisticated directed energy weapon developed by the one, the only Serbian physicist and inventor, Nikola Tesla. Yes, as in the Nikola Tesla. On the surface, the Foundation portrays this object as merely an ingenious relic left over from the inventor's legacy. But in reality, SCP-2700 is a weapon of such immense power that it is believed if it's fired, the universe itself will cease to exist. Yeah, that's pretty serious stuff. It is thought that it's down to the third component of this device, SCP-2700 Omega, the weapon's energy source, which is a discrete energy phenomena that behaves inversely with regards to entropy. There's a lot of science to it, but in layman's terms, if you fire this weapon, the energy inside of it would spread in a chain reaction, converting the rest of the universe to its inverted entropic state. In even simpler terms, it would cause a reverse Big Bang, destroying all matter and potentially, hopefully, restart the universe. So yeah, I don't want to find out. Don't pull the trigger, please.